Well, welcome back to the Playful Horizons speaker series. This week we'll be talking with a scholar from right here at the University of Alberta, Melanie Oberg, about her ongoing research, which some of you might have even participated in. And be sure to join the Q&A on November 21st at 1 p.m. So, to introduce Melanie Oberg is a PhD student and instructor in the Department of English and Film at the University of Alberta. Her research focuses on video game design and narrative, particularly what video games can tell the player without the use of language. She received an MA from the University of Victoria with a focus on Let's Play videos, fan culture, and the spectacle of gameplay. She is a recipient of the Queen Elizabeth II Graduate Scholarship and a 3-time recipient of the Academic Graduate Excellence Scholarship. Welcome, Melanie.
Hi, thanks for having me. This is
We're
awesome.
so excited. So to kind of start us off, if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself, what's your academic background, and what got you into studying video games?
Yeah, I mean, I have notes here, but I'll try to riff as much as possible. So my academic background is actually in the English department. And I played my undergrad really, really safe, and I wrote about 17th century gardens in Victorian era, and I was so bored. And then I went to do my master's in Victoria, and that's when I was like, my actual passion is like watching people play games, and I really want to talk about the affective space of that. So I wrote about like the spectacle of authentic emotions, and then after that I was like, I really want to talk about the way that games create emotions in people. I want to like cut out the middleman, if you will. Mm-hmm. And so I started looking at games that like don't have language in them at all. But I come from an English background, which is very ironic.
Yeah. It's like the last thing you would think you would look at is games that don't have language in them. Mm-hmm. So it's really cool. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I guess tell us a little bit more about that research that you're doing now for your dissertation.
Yeah. So right now, or I guess in the past 4 to 5 years, I've been doing a participant study, and I have gotten people to play through Abzu. And then afterwards, we sit down, we have a little chat, and I ask them, like, okay, what did you think about the color? What did you think about the music? What did you notice about the design? And then the last sort of question I ask them is, like, if you had to put it into words, like, what do you think the story is? And I've gotten a lot of really interesting answers, and that a lot of people are like, I think it's pretty clear that it's this. And then I've had the opposite reaction where people are like, I don't think there is a story here at all. So it's just very interesting doing participant studies and getting feedback from players that have vastly different experiences with the same game, which is cool.
Right. Yeah, that's so interesting. Because, I think people do play the same game and kind of think like, oh, that reading is going to be probably everyone's reading. Mm-hmm. But it's really interesting that it's like, actually, they can go all these different directions.
Yeah, and it was very important for me not to be like, this is how I see the game. I was like looking at fan discourses online and looking at like theory ending or like all of the Kotaku, like, let me explain it for you.
Right. Yeah.
But even the language they were using was like, I think it is. I'm not sure, but like maybe you could read it into this, right? So even people who like quote unquote were like game experts still didn't have answers, which is fantastic personally. Mm-hmm. I like it when the thing is like how you interpret it to be, honestly.
Yeah, I like that. And I think in the case of this game, the developers haven't really like given the answers away either, right?
Yeah, a lot of silent designers are like sort of mum when it comes to like fans pressing them towards like, what do you think the ending is and stuff, and they're like, it's whatever you want it to be. Yeah. I was talking to the developers of Tesla Grad, and they have very interesting like fan interactions where they're like, it is whatever you think it is, but also there's a canon story and we're not going to tell you.
They won't say what it is.
Yeah, which is, it's pretty good. So
yeah, that's fun as a developer, I think, to take that perspective. Okay, so you were mentioning before that part of your dissertation research is looking at kind of the absence of language in Abzu in particular. What do you think we could learn from silence or from the absence of language in games?
Ooh, that's a great question. I think if you're going to be like game designers, and it doesn't matter what platform or what like software you're using, I think less is more is humongous. I had all of these beautiful quotes written down, but now I'm just gonna go off the top of my head. Sure. I think it's Richard Rouse that says like gamers only really need 20% of it in order to understand. So one of my examples that I love using is like, if you're putting a grave into your game, how tall is the grass? Like, how much time has passed? Do you know this person? Just having some like environmental cues telling the player where to go and what to do, and that falls under like light and terrain. So if you're gonna make like earth berms to like sort of funnel a character someplace, or journey and rhyme use something huge in the background, you're automatically like, as soon as you boot up those games, you're like, I gotta go there, right? Like, it's huge and I wonder what's at the top of that, right? Mm-hmm. So just incentivizing players to use go places using their own curiosity. It's much less clunky, I'll say, than like talk to guy, get quest, fill off the checklist, right? Instead, if you put something in the distance that's like intriguing, maybe players are going to want to go there. So it's what I call curiosity-driven gameplay over like directives.
Yeah.
And then another part of that is meaningful movement. So putting a player in the game and saying like, not saying to them like the Star Wars spiel and like, you are the chosen one and you're going to save the universe and fight the zombies and blah blah blah, but instead putting somebody like kind of cold turkey into a game and just saying to them, move. Like, that's gameplay distilled, I would argue. Where you're like, a lot of these games that I'm looking at start cold turkey like that, and they just tell you to start moving, and which I think games do exceptionally well, where they're like, you might chop wood for like 30 minutes, but you still are like, okay, I'm having a change in this world, I'm impacting change in this world, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, that's so interesting to think about, like, the role of curiosity in games as a medium, because, a lot of mediums don't really facilitate that. That's so interesting. Cool! I love it. So something else I wanted to ask you about is using participants in your research, because participant research in game studies is kind of notoriously tricky to do in some ways. So can you tell us a little bit about some of the like advantages to using participants, and what are some of the like challenges you find in developing that kind of research?
I love doing participant studies. I'm having such a great time. I really just wanted to talk to people about these games, and I think that was my excuse. I was like, what if I was in a room with people who had played Abzu and we could talk about it? But I think it was really interesting too, because I came to this, I was watching somebody play Limbo, and I was like listening to them sort of like riff at the end, like, here's what I think it means, and they went through several different iterations and they were contradicting themselves, which is not a big deal. But I like came to this through Let's Plays and like through listening to other people talk about these games. And then I went on to forums for like Journey and Rhyme and Teslagrad and like all of these silent design games, Little Nightmares also. And I was like, what do people think it means? And like coming from reader response theory, I was like, it's whatever the player thinks it is. I've had to since backtrack and take into account designers, of course. But that was my initial curiosity. I was like, how do players grapple with the lack of language? Do they see meaning in the lack of language? And what stories are they making out of the lack of language? Like, what common themes do people pick out, if any, or like what sort of language that people are using? So I think I mentioned earlier, like the Kotaku authority stance, even their like best guess interpretations were like, I think, I'm not too sure. So the way that people feel about these games is also very important to them. So a lot of people will say something like, I think it means this, but I have a lot of feelings attached to that.
Right. So
it's a very interesting response where people don't have the answers, but feel passionately somehow about these games. And it's something that I mentioned too in like one of my first chapters. So this feeling like you're inexpressible feeling where you're like, I had such a meaningful interaction, but I don't know how to put it into words.
Right.
It's kind of how I felt playing The Last Guardian. I had to go for a quiet walk afterwards, and I was like, how do I describe that I like fell in love with a giant dog cat bird and like lost him all in the same day? And I was like,
spoiler alert,
grief stricken. Also, yeah, sorry. But I was like, I can't talk to anybody right now because I wouldn't be able to put it into words what I was feeling.
Right.
And I think it's the same thing that a lot of players come up against when they do play Abzu or Journey or Teslagrad or Rhyme or any of these silent games. I think part of the beauty of them is that it does affect you so emotionally, but you can't really articulate that, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think that that's like a challenge that's kind of unique to games that do not have language, is that they don't give you the language to understand them?
I think part of it, right? But there's also something about games themselves that is inexpressible. So one of the things that I mentioned too is like lore hunting and like Bloodborne and stuff, and people are like combing through the reads to get information about that game. But these games, because they don't have even like item description, they're not giving you little crumbs that you can follow. They're just saying like, experience this. And I do think there's some aspects of that in all games where you're like, I can't really describe to you what it felt like other games. I can't even think of it. Like, I'm building a farm in Stardew. You're like, congrats, I am now a landowner, which feels amazing in virtual reality.
It's the dream.
Yes. But, like, I do think silent games particularly run up against, like, the fallacies of language in an interesting way.
Yeah, so fascinating. So I guess, like, you mentioned a little bit earlier this notion of environmental design and environmental storytelling. What do you wish that you could kind of convey to students? Because this is a topic that we're talking about in our classes, is environmental storytelling and how to kind of take advantage of these aspects of the environment to bring the player into the story. What do you think that students need to know about environmental storytelling, and is there anything special about games in particular as a medium for doing that?
Yeah, I think that calls back to curiosity-driven gameplay. Like Journey and Rhyme are such good examples because they put just something huge in the distance and you're like, go there. But also think about like sound design as well. In Inside, one of the audio designers, I think his name is Thomas Leisha, said that he designed the opening of a door not just to sound like a door, he also layered over like animal screams. So when you're opening the door, he said in his design, he was like, I want you to obviously know that you're opening a door, but I also want you to think about like tension and like how does that sound to a player? How does it affect them? And then another thing that I wanted to bring up, because my latest chapter is on sound, so I'm still thinking about it, but Austin Wintry, in designing the final track for Journey, it's called Apotheosis. He went through several different iterations of writing that piece, and he says the very last section of that song he wanted, like, it's very stripped down, it's very like calm. He said he wanted players to lean in rather than away. And I would advise anyone who's designing games to like get your players to lean in rather than away. So it can be bombastic and it can be cyberpunk and it can be like, you know, shooting hordes of zombies, but I think games are also equally, if not better, when you get somebody to like lean in and pay attention and just maybe sometimes slow down in a game. And that falls under pacing and stuff. One of the other things I was going to say about environmental design is like think about BioShock and like strip all of the language out of that. Even if you don't know the story of BioShock, you're still in 1920s Art Deco. There's still like propaganda on the walls and there's still like blood splattered, right? So even if I didn't tell you the story of BioShock, you should still be able to like glean a bit of the story through just being in that environment, right? And that falls under sound design, lighting, soundtracks, etc., right?
Everything. Yeah, that's so interesting. I can't even describe how many times in Horizon Zero Dawn I've been killed by a machine because I had stopped to like admire the sunrise over some ruins in the forest.
Yeah.
And, like, this is just so compelling. Oh, I'm dead. But that leaning in, I think, is, a really interesting point of, like, what pulls us into the world and the story in really interesting ways. Cool. So, kind of switching tracks a little bit, you've also done some academic work on kind of the phenomenon of Let's Play videos. Could you tell us just a little bit about that research and what you learned about Let's Plays and game watching kind of as an activity more generally?
Yeah, so I did all of my undergrad, like, religiously watching Let's Plays at a time when I was quite lonely. So I really just started watching them, one, because everyone else was, and two, because I was just like, it was like having a friend, watching a friend play games. But I wrote my master's thesis on like the spectacle of authenticity in Let's Plays. Particularly, I was talking about Amnesia: The Dark Descent. And if you know that game at all, you know how traumatizing and terrifying it is. So I argued in my master's that the spectacle of like true fear is what drew in a lot of viewers, because they were like, authenticity is something that's hard to make online, and it's hard to make on Let's Plays and streaming and stuff. But I was like, the game design of Amnesia made people actually scared. Like, the veneer came off, and they were like, this is kind of who I truly am, with like none of the facade of none of the like, hey, subscribe and like these videos.
Right.
It was genuinely like, okay, I need to take a break and I can't play this anymore. So my argument was like that sort of skyrocketed the Let's Plays. I think that was around like 2012, 2015. Now they're kind of like a dying breed a little bit. Now people are more entranced by the immediacy of Twitch. But Let's Plays were just such an interesting place for authentic emotion in a medium that's largely critiqued for its performance.
Right.
And I, as a fan of them, was just like, no. These are actual human beings, and they're like in their houses, and they do have actual real emotions underneath it all. Sometimes you have to play Amnesia to get there, but for the large part, like, not everything is a performance online is what I was trying to say, I guess.
Right, but there's like kind of some authentic emotional experience that's happening kind of in there. Really interesting. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's been really fascinating to hear about your work, and can't wait for the final piece to be available for us to read, because I think it's going to be really fantastic. So thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you in the Discord for the Ask Me Anything.
Thanks so much for having me. This has been great. Thanks. Bye.
Yay.
Bye-bye.
We won't make you do like the Christmas. Oh yeah, we were.
Yeah.
Do we need
right.
to have a sign up?
Now we have to ask every guest for their favorite
Right.
sign-off.
Okay. I don't know how
Having
you're gonna
watched
edit that
so many Let's Plays, do you have a favorite sign-off?
Oh Lord, I do not.
We're gonna make you invent one on the spot. What are you even?
Smash like and subscribe.